Okay, this is one that I am really excited about. Um, does everyone know what Brian does or who Brian is? Show of hands if you know what Brian does and who he is. Okay, great. Everyone's going to be able to learn. Brian, can you hear me and can you see me? We can't hear you, so we're going to hopefully work on that while I pen.
Okay.
There we go.
Fine.
You are up. All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello. Perfect.
How was lunch?
Yes. All right. So, Brian, before I get into the questions here, and we have some slides as well to be able to back this up, I just polled everyone, and it looks like about 25% of the audience knows who you are. So 5% of the audience. Can you let them know what you do?
Sure. So I'm Brian Elliott. I co-founded a group called Future Forum. We're a think tank on the future of work that was backed by Slack, Boston Consulting Group, Miller Knoll, and Management Leadership for Tomorrow. We spent the last 3 years doing research. A product called the Future Forum Pulse. It was a survey of a bit over 10,000 desk workers, office workers around the globe. We ran for about on a quarterly basis for the last 3 years. And so a lot of you have probably seen some of that research, and that's what I'll talk to you about primarily today. I've been in technology companies for about 25 years, about 30 years of management experience overall, and currently acting as an advisor to a number of companies out there.
Amazing. I tell people that your data set is probably the most complete data set on remote work that currently exists. So I think everyone is going to learn a lot about that third category that I was talking about getting clear. This is one of those talks. So first question I have right off the bat, Brian, which may not be a little bit uncomfortable for you, but again, we can talk about it as much as you want in front of these 500 people. Happened with Future? What exactly occurred? Because if I understand, there was a shift, strategic strategy, and you guys have transitioned effectively inside of Salesforce. So tell us what happened.
More than transitioned, I am still the co-founder of Future Forum. I am no longer with Slack or Salesforce. Neither is my team. So Future Forum itself, we announced was being sunset at the beginning of April of this year. I am extraordinarily proud of the team and what we built over the past 3 years. But I think it was partly a product of the time and the place. Slack and Stuart Butterfield helped me get this off the ground back in the spring of 2020 when people really needed help and support getting through the pandemic. We produced a lot of fantastic research and work, and the body of work I think stands up on the test of time. Things changed over the course of the past year or so, and in particular, just made the Salesforce and Slack and myself and the team made the decision to sunset it this spring. So a little bit hard in terms of decision-making process, and especially hard on the team, which is what I'm most concerned about in terms of helping and supporting them, but still super proud of the work. So, we'll continue on in different ways.
Right. Yeah. If any of them need a job, I'm sure there's probably a couple hundred people here that would be happy to be able to work with them.
They're amazing.
Yeah. So as I said before, the data was great. One of the most complete data sets. And for those that don't know, my background is in sociology and econometrics. So I am a statistician at heart. So the data was absolutely amazing. I remember going through that data from like midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife telling me to get to bed. But what happens next with it? What happens next with this information?
Yeah. So what happens next is each of the individual members of the consortium, Slack itself, Boston Consulting Group, Miller Knoll, Management Leadership for Tomorrow, they're each going to continue their own work in slightly different ways. I continue to have conversations and great ones with Christina Janzer, who leads the research team at Slack. She is fantastic. She's going to keep the fire alive in a number of different ways. But it'll probably happen less frequently and a little bit less depth in some ways. But each of them is also going to take a different slice at it. And then there's other people out there too. There's the Raj Chowdhury's of the world and Nick Bloom, who do fantastic work. And I've been digging around too. And Liam, you and I talked about this a little bit. I'm going to do a bit of a Mary Meeker style presentation here, if we can pull up the slides.
Yeah, let's do it.
walk through some data because there's other people that have interesting stuff too. So first slide up in terms of the data itself is just the fact that employees themselves want flexibility. And I'll give it a second because I can tell it's not up yet.
Let's wait a second to get those slides up.
Sorry about that.
I really like your...
Anybody remember who Mary Meeker is? Mary used to do these presentations that were like, I can't see the audience, so I can't tell. You'll have to help me out here later.
How many people know what a Mary Meeker presentation is? We've got 5 people that put up their hands.
Mary used to do these presentations where she'd have 120 slides and 30 minutes of data, where she'd just be slamming through every single aspect of, internet-based companies and what they are. She was at Goldman Sachs and then Kleiner Perkins, and now runs her own VC firm here in San Francisco. But at any rate, if we get the slides up, I'll walk through a whole bunch of this stuff. The things that we found over the course of 3 years, though, that stayed the same, that really didn't change, were we changed people's minds at the beginning of the pandemic about what was possible and the trade-offs people are looking for between work and their home lives. And it opened up a lot of folks' eyes to what was different, but also what they wanted to keep on a going forward basis. And if you look at our data over the course of 3 years, what didn't change much was desire that people had to maintain that level of flexibility, to not have to go into an office 5 days a week, to not assume that 5 days a week on a 9-to-5 basis was how work got done. I am filling time here because I'm not seeing the slides still. There we go. We got. Yes. And now I'm going to go through these as quickly as I possibly can. 81% of folks said that they want location flexibility. 93% want flexibility in their schedules, meaning not 9 to 5, 5 days a week, jam-packed full of meetings. Cushman & Wakefield, real estate company, you'd think they'd be pushing for the office, has been doing a set of work in the same field as us in some ways. And their data says, ta-da, 79% of people want location flexibility and 94% want schedule flexibility.
Wow.
Now, that desire on the part of employees often runs up against executives who say, yeah, but what about productivity, culture, connection, innovation? So I'm going to walk through a few stats there as well. Turns out if you give people flexibility, you get higher productivity. Location flexibility gets you an 8% boost on your productivity scores. That's about 3 hours a week. Schedule flexibility, God forbid, giving people breaks during the day, not jamming, 9 to 5 full of meetings, gives even bigger boosts to productivity, 39% higher for those that get it that way. That's actually really important to keep in mind, that we've got to balance this out. Time actually matters as much as place when it comes to flexibility for people. Cushman & Wakefield has a bunch of data on the same thing too. And it shows that, for example, when you look at their data, choice, giving people location choice, flexibility in their schedule choice, actually does great things on a number of dimensions, including, importantly, that first column, which is your ability to focus, the ability to have time when you're awake, when you're at your best, to get heads down, work done. What about culture? Turns out culture and connection both are benefited by flexibility. People whose companies got more flexible over the course of the pandemic were 57% more likely to say that their culture improved over the past 2 years. Those same workers are actually more likely, not less, to say that they feel very connected to their direct manager, to their executive leadership team, and to their company's values. So there's a lot of mythology around, if people aren't in the office, they're not going to feel connected. That's not true and not accurate. This also shows up in a number of different ways, but partly it's because executives themselves assume the office is the only place connection happens when we're now 2 generations of digital natives into the workforce. If you give people digital tools and good ones that work well, not only do you get higher productivity out of them, you actually get a higher sense of belonging as well. Similar trends, Cushman & Wakefield did a similar set of data on what happens to people's engagement as an employee. When you look at their data from a choice-based perspective, people who have choice feel more motivated as well. At the end of the day, a lot of this basically comes back to trust. If people are given flexibility to do their work, if their managers are focused on outcomes, not attendance, they feel trusted. And if they feel trusted, they're going to be a lot more motivated as employees. They're going to feel a lot more connected to the company, and they're going to appreciate your culture a lot more as well. Innovation. This is a study that we did back in 2021. There's a lot of mythology out there about whiteboards and water coolers and the importance of people being together in order to drive innovation. I handpicked the iconography here. It's lovely. I asked my wife what it looked like, and she said it looks like a dude mansplaining to a couple of people something on a whiteboard. And unfortunately, of course, also the woman is the one that's sitting there taking notes. Unfortunately, that's not an unrealistic picture of what happens with whiteboarding sessions. More often than not, the person holding the pen at the front of a whiteboard is someone who probably looks like me, that's a more experienced, older white guy in the room who is basically using it as a command and control mechanism. There's plenty of research out there that shows that when you get into these sessions, you end up with groupthink too often, because the people who are younger, the people who are from outside the organization, who are newer to it, or who don't look like the majority, more often sit on their hands and are not sharing ideas. The study we did in 2021 took a bunch of people and asked them to rate their team's ability to be productive, but also their team's ability to be creative, to innovate on new ideas, new processes. Their location, regardless of whether they were fully in person, whether they were fully remote, whether they were in between someplace, had almost no correlation with their team's creativity. What did were a couple of really key questions. Number one, do I feel comfortable asking for help? If I do, that my odds that my team is actually going to be more creative go up 50%. Number two, is my team willing to take risks? At that point, if it's true, then my team's output in terms of creative generation goes up almost 80%. Those two factors are psychological safety. And at the end of the day, building psychological safety in teams, allowing people who have different ideas, who come from different perspectives and backgrounds, to share those ideas is going to do a lot more for you in terms of driving innovation than anything else. And that leads to the last big point from a data perspective, which is, this is what I think a lot of executives often overlook. The need for flexibility is a huge boost to building more inclusive organizations going forward. The data that we have on, when we cut it by race and gender and ethnicity in the US in particular, I think has been some of the most important data that we've produced over the course of the past 3 years. Women with children, in particular, 59% of them want to work from the office 2 days a week or less. This compares to 47% of working men. A lot of people, I think, expected that number to trend back down post-pandemic. It has not. If anything, in the US and the UK in particular, it's continued to increase. That's in part because women are more often than not the primary caregiver from a home perspective, but it's also because we have, especially in the US and in the UK, a caregiving crisis. There's a lack of supply. Prices are a lot higher. It's just harder for caregiving support to be found. And so if you're forcing people back in 4 or 5 days a week, you're really running risks with that group. The other data that showed up at the beginning of the pandemic, this started in the summer of 2020, was that people who are not in the white majority in the US in particular have a higher sense of belonging if you allow them to disconnect. Brian Lowry is a Stanford professor who attended one of our academic summits in the early going of this and said, for him personally, he felt it as a Black professor on Stanford's campus, the cost of code switching, of having to be on 5 days a week, 9 to 5 on campus, watching how he walked, how he talked, how he showed up, was taxing. The ability to dial in and dial out of those situations gave him a chance to recharge his batteries. And it's not that flexibility is a panacea, but flexibility has been a big boost, and we can see it in the scores around sense of belonging, in particular for Black and for Hispanic Latinx employees around the globe. So at the end of the day, if you're an executive and you're seeing all this data and all this research that says, whether it's from us or whether it's from Raj Chatterjee or Nick Bloom or others, that productivity goes up, and that's the thing you're concerned about. But not only does productivity go up, you can improve your company's culture, your company's connection. Innovation has nothing to do with location, and inclusion is actually dramatically better. Why are you missing it? Taryn Brim on my team gets credit for this one. Leadership nostalgia, executive nostalgia, I think is a big part of this. A lot of executives, myself included, to be honest, grew up in a world in which we assumed that things worked really well, so we should get back to how things used to work. But it didn't work for everybody. And I think that's been a big lesson that we've tried to get across as we've shared the data and research and results coming out of Future Forum. That's my Mary Meeker bit, Liam. Back to you.
Thanks. I mean, that's really interesting stuff, particularly the increases for essentially racial minorities versus the control group. But it's quite interesting. I have another question, which I know that you have some slides. Office versus hybrid versus remote. Everyone wants to know what's the breakdown here, right? What percentage should be in the office? I know that you have some insights on that. Love to get that info.
Absolutely. Glad to do it. I'm not sure if I'm up on the screen, but Liam, why don't you tell me if I am?
Hopefully those will get up there. There we go. We've got Brian's beautiful face, and hopefully those slides also pop up.
Yep. We're working.
Okay. Beautiful orange background, by the way. I don't know what you like that. It's fantastic.
B&B adventure. So, I hope everybody likes orange and some questionable artwork. But it is office versus hybrid versus remote. And we'll get the slides back up here in just a second, I'm sure, is a good question because it's both this sort of oversimplification that I think a lot of the press has done to this. It's turned everything into a remote versus office battle in a lot of different ways. It's also appropriately, especially for this group, a topic that you need to go a layer or two deeper on to really kind of get where some of the challenges lie. I really would love to see, there would go. How about that? And when we dig into the data and look at, for example, that 81% of people that say that they want flexibility in where they work, 2/3 of those want something that looks more like hybrid than looks more like fully remote. What the hybrid chunk in the middle represents is everybody that is at least 1 day a week or more in an office. The vast majority of that 66% is 1 or 2 days a week. And that's what the vast majority of that group actually says that they want. For executives, it tends to skew a little more heavily to 3 to 4 days a week. For individual employees, it tends to be in the 1 to 2 pretty strongly. And that holds up with conversations I've had with, dozens, maybe even hundreds of executives over the past couple of years, which is if they put out a 3-day-a-week mandate, what they got was 1.5 days a week, almost everywhere that you look. Same thing's true for flexibility in when people work. People are looking for flexibility in a framework. They want something that's not 9 to 5 available for their team. They want something like core collaboration hours that our team has or had between 9 a.m. and 1 o'clock on the Pacific coast in the US, when you're expected to be available for meetings and for conversations live with your team. Putting some constraints around it is a big thing. When we dig a layer deeper into the data, this is what we see though, which is, I think hybrid has been a real challenge for a lot of organizations. And what the bars represent here is yellow is fully in person, blue is fully remote, and hybrid is the one in the middle. Hybrid's consistently better than fully in person, and fully remote is pretty consistently better than hybrid as well. But that underlies a big set of mixed up variables, which is hybrid is a mix of organizations that are doing things really well and thoughtfully, and organizations that have basically just said, well, 3 days a week is the answer, or 2 days a week is the answer, and good luck to everybody, which is really not a solution. That's just putting forward a policy. And that's why I think at the end of the day, these terms all have issues with them. The word hybrid does. The word remote does too. Remote's got a big challenge, and that's that there's large-scale parts of organizations that can't be fully remote. Genentech, which we profile in our book, for example, has R&D workers that have to be in the lab at least a couple of days a week. For those organizations, the argument I end up having back is the word distributed is actually a much better word. Most teams, most companies, most organizations past 1,000 people are distributed. I've been managing distributed teams for 25 years. This is not a new concept. There's better ways for us to do it. But I think the bigger challenge is most people are saying they're hybrid, but what they really mean is that they're office-centric. And that at the end of the day, an office-centric environment is what the executives are actually creating. And that creates real challenges, especially around proximity bias when it comes to topics of inclusion. And you've got to make a decision. You can't say I'm hybrid. You've got to decide, are you office-centric? And you're going back to the way that things used to work, kind of leaving people behind and making real risks around productivity? Or are you digital first? Are you actually taking a forward-looking stance and saying, I'm first going to be concerned with the experiences of people, regardless of their location, that we all are connected together, that we are creating a level playing field, and that we're focused on outcomes as opposed to showing up. And if you're doing that, you've got a lot better chance of success. And that's the thesis behind both almost all the work that we did, as well as the book that Sheila, Helen, and I wrote, that still, I think, stands up quite well. So, Liam, I think I'm done with data.
That was a lot. I think we do have some questions, and we have them either... Oh, here we go. They're on Slido. So for anyone in the audience right now that wants to ask a question, that is where you can do it. And we already have 2 questions right now. And also for people that are online, that are streaming in, you can also ask questions, and we'll throw that in. First question that we have from Ivor, hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly. How do you actually measure productivity in reference to the beginning of the slide? So what's your methodology there?
Yeah, so it's a self-assessment that people do, but what we're doing is we're not asking people to compare, are you more productive or less productive if you've got flexibility? We're taking different populations. So we take the 10,000 people in the sample, and then we stack them in a bunch of different ways based on the race and ethnicity data, gender data I was talking about earlier, but also what their company and organization provides them in terms of policies. So we're comparing people who have more flexibility with people who have less flexibility, and how they rate their sense of productivity, their sense of belonging, other things like that. And it's the comparative stats between those two. It comes out surprisingly similar if you look at the location data to academic data coming out of Nick Bloom and Jeffrey.
Got it. Okay. Next question we've got here is from Stephanie Henson. And Stephanie asks, what are your predictions on how quickly or slowly, and that just fell off the deck. That's no worries. You're good. The shift will be, or slowly, the shift will be for more traditional work, I'm assuming. So what are the predictions on how quickly or slowly the shift will be from more traditional forms of work?
The one prediction I've got is in September in the U.S. in particular, we will have the 4th annual Labor Day return to office battle, because we've had it 3 times already. Why not have it a 4th time in a row? If you look at the U.S. data in particular, there was a big push for return to office type of mandates back in January and February. That did actually kick up attendance a bit. It actually, spreads out among a bunch of different firms. But you've also seen that level back off yet again. And we're sitting approximately where people wanted to sit in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Meaning we're at about, half the level of office attendance that the U.S. had pre-pandemic, which means you're getting people in, 1 to 2 days a week instead of 3 to 4 days a week, which if you look back at our data is kind of what people were asking for in the first place. I think the bigger challenge is going to be around who gets rewarded and who gets left behind, and that organizations that are saying, here's our push, here's our drive, the managers, the leaders are all forced back in, and they're rewarding people on the basis of attendance, are going to create some real challenges and issues. I think there are other organizations that are going to take this much further in terms of using it as a tool to get better talent. And that's not just in technology. Airbnb and Shopify have both been great on this front, as well as my compatriots at Slack, Atlassian, and others. But we've seen some great work out of companies like MasterCard and Allstate that have gotten a lot more flexible post-pandemic and are using this as a recruiting tool and as a way to attract more talent. So I think long-term what you're going to see is these things are going to wax and wane, but companies that are more flexible in their approach are going to win because they'll attract more talent, and talent at the end of the day is competitive advantage.
Got it. I have a follow-on question to that I'm going to ask because I'm here and I can ask that if I want.
You got Mike.
What do you think about the current commercial real estate vacancy rate problem that we have throughout the United States? But I think we can extrapolate that globally. There was data to show that pre-pandemic 3.6% of San Francisco was vacant in terms of commercial real estate. It's now 29.5% and 20% across the United States. That works out to, and I got the updated numbers, $22 trillion in real estate that is going to be, we don't know if it can be repurposed. I don't think people will be going back to the office completely. Where do you see that happening over the next year or two?
I think there's an interesting balance point between those two issues. Part of it is the vacancy rate definitely went up a bunch. Partly though, in those offices, most of them are not really well designed for interaction among people. We did this thing in real estate over the course of the past 20 years where we shoved more people into less space. Average square footage per employee fell by 50%. Open office floor plans really don't help. Matter of fact, there's evidence that they make things worse from a interaction perspective. And so I do think there's going to be a shrinking of some of that commercial real estate. I live in San Francisco. It is rough downtown. My hope is that some of it at least can be converted to residential use, but that's really hard as well. I think what we got to do is think about how we actually set up that space and make it so that it's actually much more amenable to what people want, which is flexible modular spaces for me to come in and do a on-site session with my team, as opposed to tons of open floor plan desk space for heads down work, which I can do much more effectively sitting at home. So I think we're going to see some shrinkage, but I don't think all of that is actually waste. I think part of it is how do we actually use the space.
Okay, got it. Karen here asks another question. What kind of teams were asked this data, engineering, operations, or sales? Do the numbers actually change amongst those different types of job categories?
Yeah, great question, Karan. So the data sampling is actually people from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of organizations. So it's 10,000 people on a Qualtrics panel that we generated. When we cut it by role within team, you don't see as much variation as most people would lead you to believe. Meaning there's sort of this supposition that engineering wants to be fully remote and salespeople want to be full-time in the office, when the truth is both those groups mostly want flexibility. Meaning that it really cuts more off of things like what's your level in the organization that it does, the function that you're in. It also doesn't show up in the same way from a industry perspective as you would think either. Meaning it doesn't matter if you're in financial services or technology companies or retail, you want flexibility. It doesn't really vary that much by industry or job function.
Very interesting. Joanna asks, very direct question, actually. What is the antidote for executive nostalgia, which is, by the way, a beautiful name for that term?
Thank you. Thank you, Taryn Brim. I'll just say it again. She's the one that came up with this one first on our team. It's a great question, Joanna. And it's one that we spent a lot of time on, and I continue to spend a lot of time on, which is coming in and talking with executive teams. Part of it is bringing data, like the data that we created, has been used a lot of times in these conversations to help executives understand it. We also talk a lot about executive teams doing two things. One is get your own data and compare it. But number two, listen to your own organization. Ask them what's working and what's not, and take your own leaders that are 2 layers down from that C-suite and the people that you want to have be successful, and ask them what they need in order to be successful. Listening is a key thing. The other side of executive nostalgia is just showing them examples of what other companies have done, because often, even though they see the data, they still are really struggling with okay, but how do I change that? And so finding very tactical examples that other companies have provided can be really helpful. And I happen to have a book that gives you a few of those too.
Yeah. Okay. I want to end with one final question, and it's actually a question for the rest of the audience, something that maybe you could help me out with. I would love it. And if we could get Brian back up on the screen, that would be ideal. Can everyone get out their phones and take a photo of Brian, Future Forum, offer of how the future works with the book? And can you add that at Slack and just say that you're having a great time at the Running Remote conference? Because I think that I would appreciate it. I think Brian would as well. All right. Thanks a lot, Brian. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you can come in person next year. I know that it was difficult for to get out there. And if anyone else had any questions, LinkedIn, and I'm guessing Twitter's the right place to find you.
LinkedIn and Slack, I guess there's a Twitter thing, but LinkedIn.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.